There are many ways to help students advance from mastering facts toward the well-informed, rigorous questioning that is critical thinking.
This video will explore 3 methods instructors can use to help students: case studies, discussion, and debates.
The field is changing every day. We have capabilities that we didn't have a month ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. And so it's interesting, as I've looked at how my teaching has changed in the 15 years since I've been a professor, I've always thought critical thinking is important, but I've shifted from, okay, you need to learn all this stuff and cram it into your brains and regurgitate it on an exam, to, I need to teach you a set of tools so that you can go out and develop marketing strategies.
The important thing about critical thinking is to get the students to the point where they're going to have the ability to learn on their own, to be able to learn how to learn, so to speak, and be able to confront ambiguous situations where there may not be a right or wrong answer.
The real value that you're giving these students is how to think through issues, right? How to adapt to different realms of truth.
Students need to develop critical thinking skills to meet the unforeseen challenges of their future work. They need to be able to learn, generate strategies, and evaluate alternatives with independence and flexibility. Structured discussion can provide a safe framework for learning to think through ideas and receive feedback in order to improve them.
It's interesting to think about how to get everyone in the course interested and willing to participate, and creating a kind of a community of trust in the classroom to facilitate people speaking up. I also prepare a 3-page guidelines for class participation that has a little grid on kind of frequency and quality, and where they can gauge for themselves. Am I speaking too much? Am I speaking too little? What makes for a quality comment? Within a short lecture, I'll have students get in groups for 5 minutes. And it can be just dyads. I change it up. Sometimes it's dyads, sometimes it's 4 or 5 people, to talk about 3 or 4 questions. And then once they've talked in a group, I can easily cold call on any person in the class, because they've already spoken aloud what they want to say, or they've heard from the person next to them if they didn't feel comfortable in their own idea.
You have group work prepared, you automatically raise the level of discussion. If you've all done that, that means you've thought about it pretty deeply already. So then your level of discussion is much higher than originally. If you just came in and you had thought about it and you had your one idea, you really had to have engaged already in debates about it and kind of deciding what you guys think as a group is most important.
One of the things that's sometimes difficult to do in a classroom is to tell a student that they're wrong. Occasionally a person will say, well, based on what I read, I think the case says this. Figuring out how to appropriately correct the student without shutting him or her down for the rest of the semester is an interesting process. And what I've found is most successful, there are a couple ways you can do that. One is to kind of deflect it to another student, and then you can get a dialogue going, and you get 3 or 4 people. You can say, well, I don't really agree, I think it's more this, and you can have it come out from the class itself. The other is to push the students' thinking further. Try to find a situation where the student's answer would be appropriate, because these are smart people, right? And yet help them understand that they didn't quite think far enough, or they didn't read deeply enough, because the other students really appreciate that as well. There was a really interesting article that came out about how Target, the retailer, is using the information that they gather about customers to proactively market to them. I posted it on the discussion board and I created a question, and it was nice because people felt free to disagree with one another. No, I think Target's going too far. No, I think this is just a good use of marketing. I try to help students find their comfort zone and then what they think is over the line. And I don't see it as my job to tell them where their line is. But it's interesting in the classroom, by having a couple cases where they can talk about these issues, I can help students uncover and discover where they think their ethical line is of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
To make the most of discussions, set concrete guidelines. Use small groups and online discussions to encourage engagement, and find positive, interactive ways of making corrections. Interactive work with case studies helps students learn to think independently about the information presented.
I typically use real-world cases to illustrate material which we're covering. So, for example, if we're doing fraud, just to use a basic example, we'll go over to what occurred at Enron, which the auditors probably should have caught and they didn't catch. And this becomes important for them to be able to go outside of Fulton Hall, go outside of Boston College, and try to think about where they're going to be and what would they do in that situation. One of the things I do, even though it's undergraduates, it's in my syllabus, it's on day one, I say it, I'm cold calling. If you're not prepared, you have to let me know beforehand. And if you let me know beforehand, I won't call on you, but if it happens more than once, you're going to be held responsible. And that expectation, where we're trying to learn together, I don't do it using fear. I try not to use the process of fear. I try to use it as a collaborative effort, that if they're prepared, I'm going to work with them. So if they come up with the wrong answer, that's okay, as long as they've thought it through. And one of the key attributes which ties into critical thinking, which I try to constantly emphasize in class, and I use that actually as a framework, is this notion of professional skepticism. That I actually put it in the syllabus, I use this as the overarching theme of the course, is that they need to be skeptical of information which they're presented with. So a lot of my cases ask them to role play as well, so that they're actually thinking about, okay, if a superior asks me to present information which just simply confirms what management wants to hear, will I be able to come up with counter arguments if I believe that management is not absolutely correct? So the case method also allows a lot of interaction between the student and the professor, and questioning and continuing to question and making them defend a point builds their skills, builds their thinking skills, and builds their ability to offer persuasive arguments which are based on solid evidence as opposed to intuition and emotion.
Ultimately, if I could back up my assumptions and say, no, I believe this is right, I can tell you why, like I can stand behind this. I think that was a good experience for me, learning to defend every assumption I had to make in order to get to an answer.
Cases are written up, and it's a third of their final grade, which is quite high. So I'm a strong believer, and as my accounting background, that the only thing that counts is that which is counted. And unless you count critical thinking skills, unless you make that a part of what's rewarded and evaluated, I don't know if students are going to actually give it enough attention. And on exams, I don't just use factual questions. I'm asking them to go through some mini cases and present arguments which critical thinking is going to be evaluated. I have a guide, a template I try to provide myself, but I have to allow myself the flexibility that their answers could take them in a different direction than what I expected.
Generally, I start with industries or products which most people are very familiar with. So before I get into more complexity, so that's essentially the issue of introducing them to the context. So, for example, I might start with something like pianos or say Steinway. And ask at a very general level, what do you think, say, Steinway's strategy is? And typically people will come around saying, oh, they have high quality pianos, or they are high priced, or somebody might say, that they are making things without using automation, they're handcrafted. And I typically put all these things up on the board. I would arrange them in such a way that they would come under certain columns, the kind of things that they've said. And then the critical thinking starts saying, why have these things come under these columns? I mean, what do you think is common with these things, the kind of things that you said? That's where now people have to step back and start thinking. It's the skill that you are giving them in terms of how do you take a very noisy, messy, complex situation where there doesn't seem to be any pattern, right? All these things that 30, 40 different people all said, okay, this is their strategy, this is their strategy. From that kind of messy complex thing, you create a very clear, focused understanding of how does Steinway compete.
To make the most of working with case studies, expect readiness and accept mistakes. Ask direct questions that encourage professional skepticism. Model the generation and organization of ideas, and assess case analysis in a formal setting, like an exam. Debates encourage students to take ownership of an argument, while keeping a critical appreciation for other positions.
There's almost this sort of deference to the professor or deference to other students where they're a little bit more reluctant to take on a challenging attitude that I think is really at the heart of critical thinking. Is in some way or another you're challenging an idea. You're challenging it to see is it true or is it not, or when is it true, and if someone has made an argument, does that argument hold water or not? So you're trying to get below the surface of an argument, and to do that you have to confront it in some way. One approach I've used that works well is to set up a debate between two teams of students, or one half of the class and the other, where there's some issue at hand that clearly does not have a right answer, but forces them both to engage the issue more deeply, but also it creates kind of a built-in confrontation, which gets over that prior issue I had. It's funny, once you set them up into a debate format, then the competitive juices start kicking in, and they're not shy at all about advocating for their position. There's a very common pattern we see in the technology world of two technologies that are in competition for a particular market, and for a variety of reasons, one generally tends to win a dominating market share. I have a structured framework for assessing the likelihood of a victor in a situation like this. And so what they'll need to do a good job of advocating for their position is to really understand the framework, do some research to find out how well each technology matches up on the criteria on the framework. And to do well, they have to anticipate what the other side is going to analyze and how they're going to make their own case so they can be prepared to rebut it. So it tends to lead to a very lively discussion. In past years, I will poll students after the event and say, gee, in the process of going through this debate, did you actually change your mind? Because students often get assigned to a position they didn't actually want to be assigned to. And it's interesting because in some ways they half convinced themselves that their side was actually the correct one when they've been forced into the position of defending it. So I think I see that as a really nice evidence of critical thinking in action, where someone has really moved from their initial or surface level position on an issue to a different position, having gone through a deeper process of analysis.
To make the most of debates, assign students to positions that will challenge their assumptions, require students to own an argument, and generate alternatives. Have students reflect on their thinking process.
You walk into the class and there's a certain electricity that comes, and you realize that every class, right, even if you're teaching the same course over years, I mean, you're changing the cases, of course, you're making them up to date and all that, but because you're focusing on the journey of how to make people think, there are always things to learn.
There are many ways to help students develop critical thinking. They all share key characteristics: setting clear and high expectations, using tools and techniques that will engage students, and providing feedback to improve their learning. A foundation in critical thinking will help students learn, grow, and meet challenges successfully throughout their academic work and into their working lives.